Okay, let's give this a shot. Melville lecture something or other. I celebrate the tale. For those of you who have made it faithfully thus far, congratulations. You've now read 89 chapters of Moby-Dick, and you've got the wind at your sails now, so only 36 more to go. And we have finally reached some key chapters like the Tale and the Fountain and the Grand Armada. And we're ready now to examine some more of the book's major philosophical imperatives, as we've been doing. Turn, if you will, to page 383. This is the very end of the Fountain chapter, chapter 85. The fountain, of course, is just the whale's spout. Many of you have probably stood on the beach in Morro Bay in the summer and seen the spouts from migrating pods. And maybe you've seen them even much closer than that on a whaling cruise or something. But Ishmael warns us not to get too close. He says, with characteristic double meaning, very much implied, do not be over curious touching the precise nature of the whale spout, or you could get scalded, blinded even by explosive rush of vapor. And this is like a typical kind of Jobian illusion, like don't go putting your nose in where it doesn't belong. Be careful concerning these mysteries. They might consume you or blind you, right? There's an allusion maybe to St. Paul getting knocked off his donkey on the road to Damascus and being blinded by looking the truth in the face. And so Melville says, be careful. As always, the spout stands for more than just itself here, like everything else in the book. Ishmael swears that if you take a true philosopher like Dante or Plato and you hold a mirror up above their head while they're, quote, in the act of thinking deep thoughts, you'll actually see condensation form on the mirror above them, like a slight mist given off by all that contemplative effort of pondering eternity. So that's sort of what the whale's mist represents in a way. Ishmael logically deduces that the whale then must actually be the wisest and most philosophical of all creatures because, look how much mist he produces from his blowhole, which could only be the result of his deep, deep thoughts that he's thinking all day. And it's a great image. Ishmael's probably just yanking our chain for a laugh, seeing, what he could do to stretch this. But he, sometimes he does seem to kind of like give credence to some of this superstitious stuff as the inexperienced whaleman that he is. But Melville goes to some great lengths here to set up this kind of silly image of the whales as philosopher kings contemplating eternity as they swim along, their thoughts rising above them like mist. And so it's kind of like worth just asking like what he is trying to do with it here. And two things I would think. Number one, he is trying to make fun of philosophers and deep thinkers, saying that all they produce is mist, right? Just like a fog. If philosophy, it tends to obscure things more often than illuminate them. Philosophy is kind of like blowing smoke in a way. It's all vanity. It's all futile. It's just wind. It's chasing after the wind. It's breath. However, in deploying this image of the mist, Melville is actually kind of like placing himself very deliberately in the company of an ancient philosophical school here. There's an old Hebrew word, an ancient Hebrew word, and the word is havel, which means mist or vapor, or like mere breath, or sometimes is like a more concrete way of putting it, just like passing empty breath, right? It's invisible, you can't see it. Often that word hebel is translated as vanity, or like futility. It's a very important word because it appears 5 times in a single verse at the start of the book of Ecclesiastes, right? This is from the Bible's Old Testament. And the standard translation, I think this is Ecclesiastes 1, 2, something like that. I don't know. The standard translation goes something like this. You may have heard this before. It's very famous. Here's the standard translation. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, a chasing after the wind. And so you hear the word vanity a bunch of times there, in case you didn't get the point. That is 5 havels, translated 4 times as vanity and once as wind. It's the same word, but it's just empty, empty, empty. Breath, 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 wind, 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 vapor, vapor, vapor. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And what does he mean? All is vanity. He means like all our like attempts to think and to understand the universe and to grasp the truth at the heart of things. We're never going to do it. It's just chasing after the wind. Another translation for this verse uses like a couple of different meanings for Hebel, even though it's the same word. And so the translation goes, all is fleeting like a passing mist, trying to catch hold of a breath. All vanishes like a vapor, right? So that translation takes each one of the Hebels and translates it differently. One says mist, one says breath, one says vapor, one is fleeting, and so on. And here's like the NIV translation, which is like, pretty recent, and it gets straight to the point, and it just says, if you look it up, meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. This is the Bible that we're talking about here. This is the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's making this interesting kind of agnostic claim. So in declaring that like the all of our attempts to understand and get to the truth are just like vaporous, Melville is actually standing in a long tradition of trying to get to the truth. He's kind of right there with the book of Job, this idea that maybe some things are a little bit beyond our knowing. But look what he does with it from here. Melville says, okay, sure, maybe our best attempts at thinking are just vapor, but sometimes, he says, vapor has a certain function. Vapor can actually be kind of useful. This is the top of page 384. This is like the last couple of chapters, or sorry, the last couple of sentences in chapter 85. And he says this: for do you see, rainbows do not visit the clear air. They only irradiate vapor. And so, through all the thick mists of the dim doubts of my mind, divine intuitions now and then shoot, enkindling my fog with a heavenly ray. And for this I thank God, for all have doubts, many deny, but doubts or denials, few along with them, have intuitions. Doubts of all things earthly and intuitions of some things heavenly. This combination makes neither believer nor infidel, but makes a man who regards both with an equal eye. So here's the human predicament in a nutshell, right? Your thoughts will illuminate precisely nothing. They're just fog. Nevertheless, you cannot hope for illumination without them. You must think in order to become enlightened. Just don't mistake your misty thinking for the truth itself. I think that's where we find ourselves. And he's doing the characteristic dialectical thinking of taking like two positions, like the believer, the infidel. What if there's a way of holding the truth of both of these things in our minds? And then he tries to do that with this image of the light irradiating the vapor. There's a wonderful writer, Annie Dillard. If you take the inner and outer nature class, we read her piece on seeing, or her piece Living Like Weasels, which is really great. She was a scholar of Thoreau. She wrote her senior thesis on Henry David Thoreau. She says somewhere, Annie Dillard, I've always loved this quote. She says, quote, I cannot cause the light. The most I can do is put myself in the path of its beam. Think about that. I cannot cause the light. The most I can do is put myself in the path of its beam. This is a very old idea. The light is eternal. The light shines whether we are there or not. The most we can do is try to be there. And to do that, you've got to think. And at the same time, you've got to doubt your own thoughts as just so much meaningless mist, so that you can see maybe what might show up on the other side of that skepticism, on the other side of the embrace of meaninglessness. Right? If you embrace the meaninglessness as fully as Melville does, the emptiness as fully as Ecclesiastes does, our like sort of mental poverty as much as Job does, some voice might speak on the other side of that. But first, you got to embrace the meaninglessness. That's the key point, right? Maybe our philosophizing is meaningless ultimately, but it's not useless. Plato's thoughts are useful. Dante's thoughts are useful. So are Melville's, and so are your own. Because if we're paying attention and the conditions are just right, and we keep breathing and we keep misting, and maybe we get lucky, the light perhaps shines through as it pleases. And the light is all there is. Everything else is vanity. The light is all there is. Okay, on the one hand, Melville, making fun of philosophers, believes the whole, and he thinks like these believers who like construct whole thought systems out of mist are a little bit foolish. They're just like whales spouting, from their blowholes. On the other hand, we need the mist to catch the light and make the rainbow. So to stop thinking philosophically, to stop seeking wisdom would be, in a sense, to stop breathing. And that doesn't seem wise at all. It's a pretty ingenious way, but I think Melville constructs a kind of intellectual imperative for the modern age based on doubt, right? Doubts of all earthly things, intuitions of some things heavenly. This combination makes neither believer nor infidel, but makes a man who regards them both with equal eye, right? The believer believes in mist, the infidel believes in nothing, and Melville wants both and neither. He wants to cultivate creative, productive, generative, life-giving doubt, not the cheap doubt of the skeptic that's like, oh, well, you can't know anything, so why try? He wants you to be committed to doubt, the doubt of the thinker, the doubt that doubts even itself, doubts even the doubt, and thus remains open to illumination from beyond. All right. Speaking of regarding a world with an equal eye, we can just turn a few pages back to page 341. Oh, good. It's right here. I have like all my Natalie Portman bookmarks to help me. This book is full of them. This is 341. This is part of his riff on the eye, on the whale's eye. He says, is it not curious that so vast a being as the whale should see the world through so small an eye, and hear the thunder through an ear which is smaller than a hair's? Okay. On one level, he's just saying, hey, look, these whales have cute little eyes and cute little ears, even though they're so very, very big. And that is true, I guess. But on another level, he's not talking about whales. He's talking about us, that we are beings of like this vast, perhaps infinite consciousness. And we live inside this vast, perhaps infinite universe. And yet the main point of interface between, us and reality is like these very small, very like rabbit-like senses. Our eyes and our ears and our senses are just kind of pathetic, but they're all we have to like, connect our being with the being of the world. And this is a strange thing when you think about it. The eye is so small in size, and yet it sees these vast things, and consciousness is so enormous, and yet it can only sort of find focal points in what we can see and taste and touch and smell. Of course, our senses are very limited. A mantis shrimp sees more of the light spectrum than we do. A dog hears more acute frequencies than we do. Mathematicians tell us that reality has 11 dimensions, but we can't see them except as vaporous mathematical abstractions of numbers on a page. So yeah, there's like a lot bigger reality out there that we can't quite see because it has to get in through our senses. And so it turns out, Melville says, that's bad, but our predicament might even be worse than that, right? We can enlarge our senses all we want with like scientific instruments, right? We can build telescopes and microscopes and stethoscopes, and we can enlarge our senses, and we can also enlarge our consciousness with like religious doctrines and philosophical truths, but this actually won't really help at all, like not even all of the telescopes in the world or the doctrines in the world will help us like perceive more of reality. And here's why. So here's the end of this passage here. This is on 341. He says, but if his eyes, and he's still talking about the whale here, but he's talking about us. If our eyes were as broad as the lens of Herschel's great telescope, and his ears capacious as the porches of cathedrals, would that make him any longer of sight or sharper of hearing? Not at all. Why then do you try to enlarge your mind? Subtleize it. That's the passage. Why do you try to enlarge your mind? Subtleize it. Okay, so he's talking about telescopes. Herschel's telescope was the largest in the world at the time, and it's like it stands for the passage in this passage for like our expanding scientific knowledge, which is huge, which is enormous. We're seeing in the depths of the universe. And then the line about having ears, like the porches of cathedrals, depicts how cathedrals, how religious systems and institutions can widen our souls and make them more receptive to hearing the truth. But our actual predicament, won't be helped by these enlarged senses of sight and hearing, because they're just not the right tools for the job. Like we don't need like more larger views of things. We need more subtler views of things, right? The truth is not a matter of enlarging your mind to take in more and more of things. It's a matter of subtilizing your mind. Is that even a word? I don't know. But you get the idea, right? Like the task of thinking is not to find more and more and more, but to make the mind more and more finely attuned to nuance and complexity, not to add more facts, but to see the facts more truly, to see them more clearly, more attentively, more subtly, to see the connections between the facts and to put them together in the right way. And more facts are not going to help you connect the dots necessarily. They might in some cases. You can see all of his analogies are limited to a point. Here's a great line. There's a Raymond Carver story. He was like a California writer from the 60s and 70s. And if you've taken Miss Shotwell's class, you'll have read him. We'll probably read him next year. Raymond Carver. He has a short story called "What We Talk About When We Talk About Love." Think about that. What we talk about when we talk about love. We're talking about love all the time, and mostly we don't know what we're saying. And we're not going to know what we're saying if we just keep talking more, if we keep enlarging our discourse about love. What we need is to subtleize our discourse about love. We need to think about it with more nuance and care and understandings and see its various internal and external relations. Having more, talk is not necessarily going to do that. Having enlarging our mind is not going to do that. So look, you guys know this. You can spend your whole life acquiring university degrees and piling up more and more knowledge and looking through all the telescopes and listening to all the profound sermons. And those are good things. But none of it matters without a mind capable of taking in the subtleties of those things, without a mind capable of taking in the subtleties of the moment that you're actually in as you are in it. Maybe it's a mistake to think that the truth is out there somewhere, like beyond the galaxy, or that the truth is contained within like a philosophical doctrine that you have to crack open like a nut to get at. What if it's more like a matter of just seeing very clearly what is there before us all the time? The person before you, the beauty before you in each day. What would that look like? No one has yet invented a telescope or a doctrine that will help us do that. But we have these other disciplines that maybe help us, maybe poetry, maybe art, maybe music helps us do this, maybe prayer, maybe having kids, maybe learning a craft, maybe playing a sport. There could be, these all could be like these subtilizing instruments, these stethoscopes for perceiving more of the world's heartbeat, so that less of it is lost on us. And the sooner that you figure this out, right, the sooner you figure out that your main problems in life will not be solved by adding more and enlarging your mind, but by loving more and understanding more of yourself and the world. And as soon as you figure that out, the better off you're going to be. Melville says so, in any case. And you might be right. You figure it out. Subtleize your mind. Think about it a little bit more. Don't go ask somebody else and add more start to see whether that is the case or not. All right, maybe another illustration of this. This is in chapter 83. This is the Jonah historically regarded chapter, which is hilarious and a little bit irreverent, but we're going to go there. It's irreverence for a good cause. The background here, Jonah historically regarded. What is he talking about? The background here is that in Melville's day, in the mid-19th century, there's this whole new array of scholarly methods for reading the Bible that began to emerge from universities, right? You would call it like hermeneutics, or like the different theories and methods of interpretation. Like, what's the best way of interpreting these texts? And you start to get not just like clergy doing this, but you start to get like secular scholars doing this and coming up with their own theories about the best way of reading these texts, and they start to seem like a little bit at odds with one another. And they probably don't have to be. Probably if both were sort of like open to what the others were saying, they would maybe both improve. But particularly in these German universities, right? He talks about like the German exegeticists or something. Particularly in the German universities, they were challenging like these old, more faith-based ways of reading, and these German scholars are like they're trying to apply something like scientific standards of linguistic analysis and historical dating and archaeology, right, and comparative anthropology to these sacred texts. And this was loosely regarded as like as the historical critical method. I think that's still actually like the term for it, the historical critical method. So you would look at like the archaeology of the town of Jericho, right? Archaeologists have found like the town of Jericho. In the Bible, the town of Jericho is supposed to have been like destroyed, and it turns out the archaeology doesn't like support that in like quite the right way. So is that story like wrong, or is the Bible wrong, or do we just need to understand that it's written for a different purpose and we can still like read it productively? And so these were like the debates in the 1850s, and it's funny that they seem to still be going on in some corners of the world. So Melville, that's the background here. When he says Jonah historically regarded, he's saying like, what would Jonah look like if you looked at it through this like historical critical lens? And Melville obviously loves the book of Jonah, and Moby-Dick is sort of like in the spirit of Jonah, deeply, deeply in the spirit of Jonah. And but he's trying to recall these debates into the reader's mind of how to interpret the book of Jonah, how to interpret the Bible more generally. Ishmael tells us about this old Sag Harbor whaleman who knows a lot about whales, but maybe not a lot about the Bible, clearly. He sees a picture in some Bible of the whale that supposedly swallowed Jonah, and he notices some inaccuracies in the picture, and this causes him to conclude, pridefully, Ishmael jokes, that the Bible as a whole is untrustworthy, because what his eyes tell him is different from what the text is telling him, even though it's not even the text. It's like a picture that some editor put in the text, but he's not, educated. So, okay, the chain of this guy's reasoning, Sag Harbor is what Melville calls him. The chain of Sag Harbor's reasoning is supposed to be a little bit absurd. But even more absurd is the Bishop Jed's literalist response to Sag Harbor's historical critical challenge to the book of Jonah. Instead of explaining that Jonah is like an ancient story whose truths are not the truths of historical fact, but rather truths of a deeper kind, Bishop Jed accepts the historical critical premise, and he tries to defend the historicity of a guy being swallowed by a whale and spit up 3 days later on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, which is ironic because the story itself doesn't even ask to be read this way, but the bishop is applying these like modern criteria of factual truth to this ancient poetic text, saying like, well, maybe like it was a right whale and it could have like not swallowed him, but Jonah could have been in his mouth. And, it doesn't matter if he's right or Sag Harbor's right. It doesn't matter who is right at this point. It doesn't matter who wins the debate, the historicist or the literalist, because both of them have actually turned the text into something it's not. Both of them have failed to see the truth of the text by accepting this like kind of modern premise about what the text is, that it has to be, sort of factually, historically accurate, or there's no truth in it. This is very foreign to the ancient idea, the idea behind the ancient text, that the writer of Jonah would have been writing with as his intention. So the doubter, Sag Harbor, dismisses the text and gets nothing out of it. The literalist, Bishop Jed, distorts the text and so gets the wrong thing out of it, right? He thinks the point is that Jonah was actually swallowed by a whale, rather than the point being that, God will have mercy on us, even in our weakness, or something like that. They both lack the subtleness of mind to really read the text well. And so Ishmael has some fun at their expense. This is 374. It's like the second sentence in the Jonah chapter. He says, now some Nantucketers rather distrust this historical story of Jonah and the whale, but then there were some skeptical Greeks and Romans who, standing out from the orthodox pagans of their time, equally doubted the story of Hercules and the whale, and Arion and the dolphin, and yet their doubting those traditions did not make those traditions one whit the less facts for all that. And it's just so great. And you see the point here, right? Melville is saying that doubting the story of Hercules doesn't make it any less factually true, because it was never factually true in the first place. It's a myth. That's the point. So if its factual truth value is 0, doubting 0 is not going to make it anything other than 0. So he says it won't, doubting it won't make it one whit less the facts, which is true if it was never supposed to be factual to begin with. Right? Melville's saying that instead of reading Jonah historically, what if we read it as the author intended, read it poetically, as conveying like a deep truth about the mystery of life, and we can doubt the historical accuracy of it, yet remain open to the story's sacred intuitions. Right? Remember, this is what Melville's trying to do. We want to doubt all things earthly, and then have intuitions of some things heavenly. So doubt the historical accuracy, and yet be open to the sacred intuition of the heavenly that might shine through it. And that kind of reading is going to make a person neither a believer nor an infidel, but one who regards both with an equal eye, with a subtle eye. And this is Melville's kind of like imperative for how to be a thinking person in the modern age, is not to just be like a cheap Enlightenment skeptic and like dismiss all these things as not historically true, and not to just be like a credulous believer who believes everything without having passed it through the crucible of critique and doubt and like critical thinking. So yes, this is the Jonah chapter is it's a little kind of inside baseball in some ways, but I think you can kind of see what he's up to. Let's look at another chapter, the tale. This is chapter 86, and the tale opens. This has to be one of the best openings in all of literature, right? He says, this is page 384, the tale. Other poets have warbled the praises of the soft eye of the antelope and the lovely plumage of the bird that never alights. Less celestial, I celebrate the tale. I mean, do you see what he's doing? This once again. He is doubting and parodying this kind of like romantic nature poetry that would warble the praises of the celestial nightingale and all that. But he's going to do Wordsworth one better, actually. He's going to celebrate, the tale. And as a reader, you don't know whether to cringe or to laugh when he starts into the sublimity of the tale. Could annihilation occur to matter? This were the thing to do it, he says, which is just so insane and hyperbolic. And you can't believe that he can deliver that line with a straight face, but he does. And this is a really key point to get. In some ways, the genius of Ishmael's character is not that he like lets Melville say things that seem serious, but then you realize, haha, it's meant to be ironic. He does do a lot of that. The really brilliant thing that makes me love Melville so much is when he does the opposite, like in this chapter, where he starts off on what you think is like kind of a comic riff, like I celebrate the tale, and ends up in this place where it dawns on you at some point that maybe a part of him isn't actually kidding about this stuff. Maybe the whole posture of Ishmaelian irony is just there so that Melville can, like, for lack of a better word, trick himself into putting his own mind on the page. The Ishmaelian irony allows him to look one way and then like look over here while he's writing over here, and then he looks back and sees like, what is it that I've written, and it's almost like this weird way that he has to use these artificial devices of like literature and character and persona to go places that his mind like wouldn't really be able to go otherwise. He might be too afraid to go otherwise. And this is what art does for us. It like helps us see truths that we wouldn't otherwise know were in us. Ishmael, Melville has to have this like shield of Ishmael's irony in place. Otherwise, he would get gun shy and he wouldn't, dare to try to venture something as serious as he's about to say in the tail chapter. And sometimes these moments that, the shield slips and we can see that there's something so real, so deadly serious about this like weird, insane rant that he's on. And these moments where the shield slips are some of my favorites in the whole book. And one of them is right here. I'll show you at the end of the tail chapter. This is the bottom of 388, bottom of 388 and the top of 389 at the very end of chapter 86. He says, "Dissect him how I may then. I but go skin deep. I know him not, and never will. But if I know not even the tail of this whale, how understand the head? Much more how comprehend his face, when face he has none. Thou shalt see my back parts, my tail, he seems to say, but my face shall not be seen. But I cannot completely make out his back parts, and hint what he will about his face. I say again, he has no face." I say again, he has no face. What does this mean? For some context, in the book of Exodus, in the Old Testament, Moses says to the Lord, "I beseech thee, show me thy glory." He wants to see God. He wants to see the truth. And God says, "Thou canst not see my face. No man shall see me and live." And you can see, Melville, when he's using words like shall, "by face shall not be seen," "thou shalt see my back parts," "thou shalt," he's like calling to mind this passage in the Old Testament. And Moses is like, "But God, I want to see your glory." And God says, "Okay, why don't you go stand in this corner of the rock and like in this crevice, and I'm going to cover you with my hands, and I'm going to pass by the cliff and the rock, and I will remove my hand. And when I take away my hand, you can come out and you can see my back parts." So this is Exodus, this is verse 23. He says, "I will take away mine hand, and thou shalt see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen." Melville is trying to make a very profound point here, that the sacred, that the holy cannot be approached directly. We have to approach these things indirectly, just as Ishmael allows Melville to approach these things indirectly through this extended 500-page metaphor of the whale. We can't bear to look some of these truths in the face. It's like if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. What happens when you look directly upon the glory of the Lord, right? You basically melt into a pile of spaghetti sauce and silly putty, like the Nazi guy does. It's a great scene if you don't know that scene. I think we watched that film at Mrs. Bartell's house a couple years ago, a bunch of Sloka students. Anyway, so Melville believes this. He believes that the truth cannot be approached directly. So don't try to write a book about the holiness of God. You're just going to end up, blowing all this mist. Instead, write a book about a whale. Write a chapter about the whale's tail. See what happens. See if you can trick your mind into saying something real about the holiness of God that you would otherwise be like too self-conscious to even reveal to yourself. This is Melville's great art. It's part of what makes him a modernist. It's part of what makes him, a valuable modernist and not just like a cheap modernist. Let's look at two more chapters here, since we're going to run out of time. The Grand Armada chapter. Ooh, this is a good one. This is 87. This chapter raises these profound questions about the non-human world. There's actually like a book out there. Jeff Sanborn, you read his piece earlier on how to read Moby-Dick. He has a book about like Melville and the non-human world. Melville's very interested in these worlds that we don't have access to. Um, and and he's interested in how human beings interact with nature, and how nature has like an agency and a life and like a telos of its own apart from human beings. And somehow that's like good to tap into from time to time. And we get a moment of that in this Grand Armada chapter 87, where during a particularly brutal killing spree, Ishmael's boat winds up in the center of like a huge pod of whales. And it's sort of like a hurricane where the center can actually be very calm, even as chaos rages all around the edges. And apparently, oceanographers say that the sperm whales actually do this, right? They assemble in these circular formations for defense with like, the mothers and children at the center, and the bulls sort of like trying to defend them on the outside. And at this point, you just sort of have to speculate that any creature that's smart enough and socially organized enough to do that, to like create defensive formations of their young, should probably be left alone to do their thing. So you could read this passage certainly as like a precursor to a kind of modern environmental sensibility, where these guys are just sort of bloodthirsty and throwing their darts and into all these different whales in the outer ring. And yet the whales, especially in the inner ring, are exhibiting these characteristics of like loving family relationships that none of these sailors seem to have, right? Like, what if Ahab had like, been sufficiently loved by his mother and by his family? Like, maybe he wouldn't be, so crazy. So maybe this whale who's like feeding her calf here in the center of the Grand Armada, maybe that whale has like more sort of advanced human qualities and wisdom than Ahab does at some points. I think it's key that Melville invests a kind of awe and like maybe even like religious devotion to his writing about the whales here. We've all seen paintings of the Madonna and Child, right? They're thousands and thousands of them in art galleries all over the world. This is probably the most frequently painted image in all of Western art. It's Mary with Jesus at her bosom. And here Melville has like these young whales nursing at their mother's breasts and staring up through the clear water into the eyes of the whalemen with a kind of like soulful intelligence, even holiness, like just how sort of the Christ and the Madonna look out from these paintings. And I think that the parallel there is intentional. He's trying to invest nature with something of the sacred, something of this otherness that we don't understand. That nevertheless, even though it can be violent, can also be very tender, and we can be very violent and irrational. So I'll read you just like this passage. This is on page 398. This is sort of in the middle, maybe toward the end. A little bit of the Grand Armada chapter. And it is just so exquisitely beautiful. I'm just going to read the whole thing and just listen to this. He says, "But far beneath this wondrous world of the surface, another and still stranger world met our eyes as we gazed over the side. For suspended in those watery vaults floated the forms of the nursing mothers of whales, and those that by their enormous girth seemed shortly to become mothers. The lake, as I have hit, so they're pregnant down there too. The lake, as I have hinted, was to a considerable depth exceedingly transparent, and as human infants, while suckling, will calmly and fixedly gaze away from the breast, as if leading two different lives at the same time, and while yet drawing mortal nourishment, be still spiritually feasting upon some unearthly reminiscence, even so did the young of these whales seem looking up toward us, but not at us, as if we were but a bit of gulfweed in their newborn sight. Floating on their sides, the mothers also seemed quietly eyeing us, one of these little infants that from certain queer tokens seemed hardly a day old, might have measured some 14 feet in length and some 6 feet in girth. He was a little frisky, though as his body seemed scarce yet recovered from that irksome position it had so lately occupied in the maternal reticule, where tail to head and all ready for the final spring, the unborn whale lies bent like a Tartar's bow. The delicate side fins and the palms of his flukes still freshly retained the plaited, crumpled appearance of a baby's ears, newly arrived from foreign parts. And thus, though surrounded by circle upon circle of consternations and affrights, did these inscrutable creatures at the center freely and fearlessly indulge in all peaceful concernments, yea, serenely reveled in dalliance and delight. And it's a picture of peace, and it belongs not to us, not to Ahab, who has no peace, not to Ishmael, who's restless and a wanderer, but to the whales. This scene of serenity is taking place in the middle of a bloodbath, remember, and thus we get this marvelous passage. Here's the very next sentence. I'll read it to you because I have heard of somebody who was actually in the process of passing away, of dying. And as he was dying, this was the passage he was repeating to himself. These were his last words over and over. I'll read you this passage. This is the real thing. It does not get any better than this. This is the middle of 399. Melville says, "But even so, amid the tornadoed Atlantic of my being, do I myself still forever centrally disport in mute calm. And while ponderous planets of unwaning woe revolve around me, deep down and deep inland, there I still bathe me in eternal mildness of joy." Even so, even amid the tornadoed Atlantic of my being, do I still forever centrally disport in mute calm and bathe me in the eternal mildness of joy. It doesn't get any better than that. This passage is a treasure of human words. Okay, that's the Grand Armada. The last chapter, let's look at the last chapter real quick. Fast fish and loose fish. And this is another one of his, deeply critical, sort of acerbic chapters. To set this up, multiple whaling ships are hunting the same pod, and they're killing more whales than they can chop up and boil at the moment. So what do you do with like all your dead whale carcasses? Well, you plant flags in them. You plant flags in the carcass, wave poles, and that's how you claim them. And there's all this like fine print jurisprudence and like legalese that helps you decide who owns the whale. And to summarize it, we've got these terms fast fish and loose fish. A fast fish has been claimed by a party holding fast to it, and a loose fish is fair game for anybody to go and spear and take for themselves. There's a brilliant double play here on a couple of things, but the main one here is colonialism. Maybe secondarily, like Calvinism and some other things. Melville's always working on a couple of different valences, but colonialism we'll talk about mainly because it's easier. Ishmael has this whole riff on like, what is Ireland but a fast fish? What is India but a fast fish? What is possession if not the whole of the law? And he's saying like you could just like claim Ireland and you can just claim India, and if you possess it, then it's legally yours. As sane, civilized people, we know that possession is not the whole of the law, right? I can't just reach over and grab your tri-tip sandwich and then say it's in my hand now and therefore it's mine. That's not how property law works, but Melville is pointing out that's exactly how colonialism works. It's this like kind of dubiously legal and definitely not moral way of going into a territory, planting a flag in it, calling it yours. But somehow during, he says, what was America in 1492 but a loose fish? This is part of our history too, as both the colonized and the colonizers in some ways. somehow, even in the 1850s, this is not the 1400s anymore, even in the 1850s and even into the 20th century, and maybe in some ways even today, that you'll learn about in modern history, um, the colonial era was just like a time when everybody was just doing this, right? It was like all the rage. We're going to read some of those texts next year. Things Fall Apart. This like book about pre-colonial life in Nigeria. For now, this is all kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Just know for now that colonialism, just sort of planting your flag and taking this territory, literally redrew the map of the entire world, and in doing so killed millions and millions of people. There's genocide wherever colonialism went, practically in Africa. And we enslaved Europeans, Americans. Like, we enslaved and impoverished millions more people. And even today, conflicts like the Sunni Shia conflict in the Middle East really come down to the fact that the borders of these countries were carved up by colonial powers who were pretty ignorant of the people who were actually living there, and that created a lot of chaos as a result. Where you have trying to make one country out of a couple of different groups. And okay, the other important thing to know is that in this chapter, Melville is on to the fact that the United States was doing this as well. He includes Texas in his litany. Texas, of course, makes the list. But if you look around you, also the land that we are sitting on right now, California. This was legally stolen from Mexico. It was all legal because, we're the ones who make the laws that make it legal. That doesn't make it right or just. There are lots of people who were upset about this in Melville's time. Thoreau famously protested the Mexican-American War by not paying his taxes, and he got thrown in jail for it. He said, "I'm not going to pay taxes for this unjust colonialist enterprise." Emerson said of it, he's got this famous quote. He says, the United States will conquer Mexico, sure, but it'll be like a man who swallows arsenic and brings him down in turn. Mexico's going to poison us. He was right. A few years later, the Civil War breaks out over, in part, whether these new territories we acquired are going to be slave states or free states, and has to be a balance. And this is part of what pushes us towards civil war, was the conquest of Mexico. This is all part of American history, and it is part of world history, and we can't ignore it. And Melville is drawing it to our attention here, but he goes even further. Of course he does. He's Melville. And he ends by saying, our own thoughts and our words and our beliefs, these are all loose fish too. Anybody can kind of come along and snag them and claim them as their own. And wow, okay, this is a weird picture of the world where we're kind of going around planting our flag in various things. And finally, he says, "What are you, reader, but a loose fish and a fast fish too?" Other people are going around and making their claims on you. And it's like, whoa, this is one of the lines that kind of stops you cold. Yeah, on the one hand, yeah, you're free and you have self-determination and free will. On the other hand, you're claimed. You're bound up by so many of these forces that have, stronger or maybe more dubious claims on you, claims on your time, claims on your attention, claims on your freedom. And you realize that without knowing it, this book all along has been training you to think like this. It's been training you in an obstacle course, how to think below the surface of things. This book has been a lesson in subtilizing your mind so that when he says something crazy like "you are a fast fish and a loose fish too," it kind of makes sense. And you think, oh, I see now where he's going. And now we're thinking. Now we're being literary thinkers, where our mist is hopefully able to be illuminated by some of these truths, but it doesn't happen without all of this mist that Melville has to throw up about fast fish and loose fish. And here are all these arcane Dutch seafaring laws from 1695 and all this stuff. Okay. This is probably where we should leave it today. A lot of these chapters may seem like philosophical mist-making, but they have these moments of enlightenment that happen as you're reading, if you're paying attention, and they keep happening over and over, even when you put the book down and you walk out and you think, fast fish, loose fish. Wow, I see this going on everywhere in the world around me. That's the goal, I hope. I think that's Melville's goal. Anyway, that is enough for today. Go have a subtle day and be loose fish in the world. But remember, you're also fast fish too. So you'll have to come check the Weebly and see that next time. All right, this was fun. Happy weekend. I'll see you guys later.